pattern for a UFR, we're looking for a capsular pattern. Right. If it doesn't match up with either of those, then we'll probably go into a cluster of tests, look for a labral lesion. But as it starts out, looking at kind of the typical examination process, we have active, passive, and resisted. So typically we would start, why don't you kick your rubber shoes off? Okay, what we would start with, I typically would say, is we'll start with flexion, so go ahead and bend your knee up towards your chest. Okay, looking at willingness to move, excursion, all those different things. We're going to overpress, asking if they have any reproduction of symptoms. And then we're going to say, don't let me push you any further, so hold there. Good, looking at hip extension strength, right? Then we're going to drop this knee back down. We're going to ask them to swing their leg out to the side as far as they can, good. Typically, I'll want to step to the side here so I can stabilize the pelvis, relax that for me. And then we would overpress, right? And then I'd say, don't let me push any further. Good. Okay. We're going to scooch this leg over. We're going to ask them to swing this leg together. Good. And we would fix, relax. And we would overpress first. I would say, don't let me push you any further. Okay. Rotations become a little more complicated here. I typically have to bring them up into this position. I'd say swing your foot in. Okay. And we would overpress and then say, don't let me push you any further. Good. I would bring them back to neutral. Swing your foot out toward me. Overpress them. And then don't let me pull you any further. Okay. That is the by the book version. We should, in theory, let's flip you over onto your stomach here for me. And again, we'd have to switch sides, so we're testing the same knee, or same hip, I should say. We would have them bend the knee here, fixate the pelvis and say, lift your knee off the table here. Good, and then we would fix and overpress, and then don't let me push you any further. And let that back down. Okay. Flip back onto your back for me. Now, in most cases, there's very rare instances where I'll actually do that whole sequence of things, right? I'm pretty much looking at this from a perspective of, there are three kind of patterns that I'm looking for associated with the three potential pathologies that I'm concerned with, and I'll just go right in looking for those, right? So, first thing I'll start with, just to show you, again, we're going to passively bring this up. We're going to look at hip flexion, looking for deviation, right? I'm going to test an inner quadrant, right? This is the Fadir test. Feeling for end feel as well as any potential clicking or clunking. And I'm going to bring them back to here. I'm going to test passive internal rotation, passive external rotation. I'm going to say hold here, don't let me pull toward me. Test hip external rotator strength. And then eventually we'd get them onto their belly and look at hip extension quadrants. Right, so the actual process versus, the by the book version of these things isn't exactly the same. And I'm perfectly okay with it if you guys break it down kind of as I have in that regard. Right? So essentially, as we bring them up into hip flexion, we're looking for the deviation that matches up with the UFR. The Fadir test could be any number of things, right? In fact, it could be a component of all three. Right? So positive Fadir test, particularly with a clunk, is indicative of a labral tear. Positive Fadir test with a lack of end range motion and a hard capsular end feel is indicative of an arthrosis. And a pinch with reproduction of pain and a loss of motion is indicative of a UFR. Right, so we're going to test that one way or the other. Internal external rotation, that's going to be my pattern breakdown between the UFR and a capsular pattern. Hip extension, I just need to know how much of it I have or don't have, and whether or not it's painfully weak, which would again be potentially something that would crop up with a sign of the buttock. But again, that's pretty substantial pathology. Most people aren't going to come in with that stuff. Okay, so that's our active, passive, resisted. You can tweak it how you would like, but that's how I do it in the clinic. The second part, not the original part. And I'm perfectly happy with it if that's what you guys did. Okay? Now, for the quadrants, we did one. right? So the Fadir quadrant is another flexion quadrant, and that is flexion, adduction, and internal rotation, right? That's what it stands for. Faber quadrant is here, right? So we're flexion, abduction, and external rotation, right? So in theory, we have to quadrant this from here before letting it fall out into the typical Faber position. Again, this is going to fall into part of the three-piece cluster for labral tears. Positive Faber test is indicative of a labral tear. Let's flip you over to your stomach. Now the extension quadrants, you can do them very easily, right? So if I'm looking at his right leg here, we have extension, adduction, internal rotation. Okay, so to do that on this particular leg, it's actually real simple. What I would do is I would get my hand immediately underneath the knee. I'm going to fix the pelvis, and I'm going to lift and let just the vector of my hand produce the internal rotation, extension, and adduction, right? So just above the patella here, and I'm just leaning with my trunk, right? So leaning to stabilize, leaning to lift, appreciating my end feel. That should give us a good feel for the Y ligament. That's the iliofemoral ligament, if I'm remembering right. And then if we want to switch to do extension, abduction, external rotation, all I do is I turn my hand over and I come from the lateral side. Again, fix and lean. Pretty simple. Any questions about that?